So I think most people recognise this is probably going to be the key issue of the upcoming election. There are many, many other issues which we're fighting on, but unless we have a realistic series of policies in regard to housing, I think that's where the battle is going to be fought. The government are getting trounced on it, they're making efforts, but they're not going far enough, they're not getting the results they'd like to get. Sinn Féin see it as a major opportunity for them. I think there are serious difficulties with the policies Sinn Féin are putting forward, and it's up to us to come forward with a realistic series of alternative options. No. Housing, of course, affects many, many key demographics. First and foremost, young people who want to own or rent a home, and they're not able to do so. Rent is increasingly becoming unaffordable. And ownership of a home, which when we joined the European Union, we actually had the highest rate of home ownership of any European country. We've now slipped down to around the average. It's no longer correct to say that Ireland is primarily a house owning or property owning democracy. Without home ownership, your democracy begins to falter. Older people who see their children unable to gain access to housing, they were able to do it. They were able to get a mortgage at relatively reasonable terms, which they could afford, sometimes on a single income, sometimes on both incomes. But they were able to acquire housing, and they resent the fact that their kids can't do it. Working people who feel themselves being left behind and feel themselves being discriminated against, largely because of our open doors immigration policy, and we have to ask what impact that is having on housing. It's having a real impact on housing, as we will demonstrate. The small landlord, the person who owns an extra house, he's inherited a house maybe in his 30s or 50s or whatever, and his parents died. He wants to try to make an income out of it, and he finds he can't. It's too prohibitive. The taxation is too high. It's bureaucratic. If he hands over the house to somebody, he can't get it back again. You know, that really is an issue. That has to be looked at. They're being squeezed out by the vulture funds, who have a much preferential tax rate of 15% as opposed to the 52% that a single individual would pay. Developers, and small developers and large developers, and individuals who want to build their own housing, who are finding increasingly that the planning system is impossible. It's excessively bureaucratic. It is not orientated to allowing development. It's not orientated to allowing individuals to build their houses or small builders to build their houses. So the key problems to be addressed, that the Irish Freedom Party can address, are first of all the inequitable taxation system which is forcing private homeowners out of the market, and ensuring that the vulture funds have a far greater amount of the market. Excess provision for migrants and bogus migrants, who are undoubtedly exacerbating the housing crisis, an overemphasis on the state providing housing. We've got to try to ensure that people have a right to home ownership. That should be our primary focus. Of course there's a role for state housing, but it shouldn't be the primary role of provision of housing. Corporate tax for vulture funds gives them an unfair advantage over a private renter. Excessively high building regulation standards on installation and emissions has forced up costs. Now we have to look at how we deal with that. Housing now, to get a 1,500 square foot house or 1,200 square foot house costs a far higher proportion of our income than it did when I first got my mortgage. There's a reason for that. The product is far better, but we have to respond to that as well. Access to finance is increasingly difficult. People are not able to get access to finance at reasonable terms. And the government is unfortunately using this crisis to attack property rights, as we see through the proposed 39th Amendment to the Constitution. The IFP approach and policy directions must be to restore the balance to incentivise home ownership for private people, to develop a humane immigration policy which does not affect the Irish people and which does not exacerbate the housing crisis, to make the taxation system fairer to the small house builder and homeowner, and to simplify the planning and regulatory system to underwrite mortgages where necessary. The government are proposing a referendum to provide a right for housing. We don't need a referendum to provide a right to housing. We need to reinforce the right to build. And that's really what's throwing us down. Taxation. How do we change the taxation to promote home ownership? Why is there 12.5% VAT rate, a levy on the entire cost of the house when a first-time buyer goes to build a house? There's absolutely no reason why we should do this. Home ownership of the first-time buyer is a social good. VAT is a punitive taxation. There's absolutely no reason why this should not be abolished immediately for the first-time buyer. And we have proposed that it will be abolished. Now, without a doubt, the European Union is going to come after us on this, without a shadow of a doubt. Now, this is where we're quite strong. Yeah, but we want to pull out of the European Union. This is not the reason why the European Union isn't working for us. We're facing a housing crisis. This is one way that you could stop it immediately. It would not have an impact on house prices because it would only affect the first-time buyer. It would only give an advantage to the first-time buyer. Mortgage interest relief. We will advocate for a full return of mortgage interest relief, and for the first-time buyer, a double mortgage interest relief. It makes sense. If you run a business, you get a tax write-off on the interest that you pay on a loan. Why is it different for housing? Why should it be different for housing? Why don't we at least treat the ordinary homeowner the same way as we treat a private business? Vulture funds have a 50% corporate tax rate on the property that they rent. That's a huge advantage that they have over the small landlord, who pays 52% and is hit with all kinds of bureaucratic constraints. We would insist, well, the 15% corporate tax rate has worked very well for us, but we would insist that rental property is not part of corporate business. Renting houses to people should not be part of that very advantageous corporate 15% tax rate. That's to promote employment, it's to promote industry, it's to promote legitimate business. It's not to promote landlordism. What we're seeing is a massive transfer of wealth at the moment into corporate funds, and a massive transfer of the ownership of housing, and a reduction in the levels of home ownership in Ireland. And one way we can deal with that is to end the 15% corporate tax rate for renting houses for vulture funds. We also advocate simple properties for the homeowner. Give them tax relief on repairing their homes. Again, if you have a business and you have an industrial facility and you spend money repairing it and maintaining it, that's a tax write-off. You don't pay tax after that. Similarly, why is it different for a homeowner? Why doesn't he get a write-off, maybe $5,000 a year, $5,000 every 2 years, to repair and maintain his house? That's a public good. Because if he maintains his house, the house will last longer, and we have a better housing stock. It will also almost certainly be self-funding, because if you get a $5,000 tax write-off, you'll probably spend 10 grand, and the amount of POAP or side that will be generated by your spending that 10 grand will more than cover the loss of tax to the revenue. So I would see that as an absolute win-win. There's no loss to revenue over something like that, and it's a real incentive to a homeowner. You go to a homeowner and say, we're advocating you get $5,000 tax write-off every year to repair your house. They know damn well they're crucified by painting their house, repairing plumbing, and they don't get a dime for it, and they should. You're putting a roof over your family's head, you're entitled to get a tax write-off for that. We would say that all local authority and housing association tenants should be given the right to purchase. We want to promote property ownership. If they own property, they'll vote for us. Okay? Just remember that. Now, there is also, of course, a role for public housing. I think that we should give a direct, we should return the situation to where local authorities are building houses directly, because they haven't been doing that for years. They've been doing it through housing associations. They had the skills, they had the engineering departments, they had the small builders who used to build houses directly within local authority areas. And I think we've got to reinstate that situation, and that should be the direction of provision of public housing, to give the local authorities the power again to directly build houses for social housing rather than subcontracting them. The impact of immigration on a housing crisis. This is the elephant in the room. And this is the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. If you even mention that, look, we're letting 100,000 people into our country, do you not think this might have an impact on housing? I mean, come on, guys, it's basic common sense. There's nothing wrong with saying that. Everybody in the street says it. But if we try to say it on a radio station, somehow they will call us racist. It's got nothing to do with racism. You simply cannot allow huge numbers of people into your country and guarantee them a right to own-door housing and not affect the housing crisis. Of course you will. So we need to hit that one. The Dublin protocols mean that only those arriving here as a first destination are we obliged to house, are we obliged to take in. That must be enforced. We must resource our airports so that people will be prevented from entering the country if this is not their first destination. If they arrive without documentation, sorry, they can't get entry. If the airports allow them off the plane without documentation, sorry, it's their responsibility. That's very simple to do, and that solves an awful lot of the problems that we're facing. People are being driven mad by seeing obvious con men showing up in this country and being admitted into the country and demanding housing. We're now reading of the possibility that the Supreme Court, that the courts may decide that people who come to this country and don't get housing have a right to be paid compensation by the state. How much do you think that's going to cost us? Or how long do you think that could last? Now, we have a right to disengage from the UN Migration Pact. Under the Nice Treaty, we also negotiated derogation from immigration policy. We're not obliged to sign up to the EU Charter on International Protection. We can withdraw from that anytime we want. So when the government says we have international obligations, we are entitled to withdraw from those obligations anytime we want. Those obligations are creating a serious social and housing crisis for this country, and it is right that we should withdraw from them. What is happening is that we are placing an impossible burden on Ireland, and that burden will eventually be paid for by the Irish taxpayer and by the Irish homeowner. So it is appropriate that we should stop. We will advocate that while there must be yes, there are people who have legitimate reasons for coming here. There are legitimate asylum seekers. Their accommodation should be humane, it should be communal, and it should be temporary. And it should be made absolutely clear that it's temporary. And if that can't be done, then we must withdraw from the UN Migration Pact, and we must withdraw from the European Union Agreement on International Protection. Planning regulations. Now, I would say don't get me started on this, because I do intend writing a far more detailed position paper on this. There's two things that we will be advocating. I will be finalising the policy on this. Objectors to the higher courts on environmental issues in particular can hold up housing schemes in this country easily for 5 years. It's not uncommon to have a substantial housing development delayed in this country for up to 5 years. The state of Arkansas, which is about the same size as Ireland, you can build, you can acquire a site, get your consents, and build your 100 apartment unit quicker than you can get planning permissions for that 100 apartment units in Dublin. So from the moment of site acquisition, through costing, through the design development, through planning application, through going to the European Court of Justice, it is gone. It's out of control. It is a system that is absolutely out of control. Now, we have interposed the European Union directives on environmentalism in a way which absolutely damages us and makes it far too easy for objectors to bring issues to the courts. My solution to that is that if any housing is zoned, there must be a guarantee for the developer, for the homeowner, that he will get planning permission. And if there are environmental issues, they should be trashed out at that stage. If there's a need for EIS, if there's a need for appropriate assessment, if there's any environmental issue, that must be assessed by the local authority before they zone the land. It is not appropriate that these delays are taking place when a planning application is being lodged. Those matters should be dealt with prior to the development plan being made. And that's it, because we have an obligation under international law to allow individuals to have an input into planning matters. But it should be done at the development plan stage and not at the planning application stage. That would be a very, very significant change. I'm going to develop a more detailed paper on, but it is something. A lot of people are really fed up when they see good housing schemes being delayed for unconscionable periods of time over utterly ridiculous matters. Like the situation we had in Doonbeg, where there was a particular type of snail. Now, apparently these snails, they morph every couple of 100 yards. This particular snail, Angustia primus or something was his name, was almost identical to the snail over in the other field, but he wasn't, so he was regarded as a unique species. And they were building a golf club there. This delayed the thing for like